She joked, "If you can play Mozart, I'll marry you." She never expected the janitor's response to leave her completely speechless. The late afternoon sun spilled across the polished marble floors of Sophia Morris's mansion, painting the space in warm gold and deep shadows. The air carried the faint, expensive scent of fresh lilies from the arrangement in the entry hall. Sophia moved through her home with the same composed, purposeful stride she used in the boardroom, heels clicking softly against the stone, posture perfect, her deep brown eyes scanning the immaculate space as if she were inspecting her own kingdom. At 35, she had built a reputation as one of the most formidable CEOs in the tech sector, a self-made millionaire whose company had grown from a cramped one-room office into a multi-billion-dollar empire. Her home reflected that success. High ceilings, walls lined with art she'd collected from around the world, and in the center of the sunlit living room, a glossy black grand piano that served more as a statement piece than a source of music. As she passed the doorway to that room, a movement caught her eye. James Carter, the new housekeeper, was standing by the piano, a soft cloth in hand, polishing its surface with slow, careful strokes. He was dressed in a simple uniform, pressed shirt, dark trousers, and the faint scent of lemon polish hung in the air around him. His dark hair fell slightly over his forehead as he leaned forward, absorbed in his work. Sophia paused in the doorway, her gaze sweeping over the piano. It had been years since anyone had played it. She had bought it for its elegance, not its sound. Something about the scene, the quiet concentration of this man, the soft light falling across the polished wood, stirred an impulse in her. "Tell me, James," she said suddenly, her voice carrying the effortless authority of someone who was used to being answered. He straightened, turning to face her. "Yes, Ms. Morris?" His voice was calm, respectful, but there was a trace of wariness there, as if unsure what she might say next. Sophia let the corner of her mouth curve into a smirk, the kind she used in meetings when she wanted to test someone's composure. She gestured casually toward the piano. "If you can play Mozart," she said, her tone half-teasing, "I'll marry you." The words hung in the air between them, absurd and deliberate all at once. To her, it was just a quip, an idle remark thrown out to amuse herself in the middle of an otherwise ordinary day. She expected him to laugh politely or shake his head, to dismiss it as the joke it clearly was. But James didn't smile. His expression barely changed, though something unreadable flickered in his eyes for the briefest moment, a shadow of thought, of memory. Then he looked back at the piano, placed the cloth neatly on the bench, and said evenly, "I'm afraid my job description doesn't include music, Ms. Morris." Sophia gave a soft, amused laugh. "A shame," she replied lightly, and with a final glance at him, turned to continue down the hall. Yet as she walked away, the moment stuck with her. It was nothing, just a passing comment, a private joke in her own mind. And yet she couldn't help but notice how he hadn't dismissed it with the kind of flustered denial most people might give. There had been a steadiness in his voice, something that hinted there was more beneath the surface. She didn't know it yet, but that one careless sentence would set in motion a chain of events that would unravel the neat order of her world and reveal a truth she could never have imagined. James Carter's mornings began before the first light brushed the treetops outside the Morris estate. By the time the sky began to pale, he was already moving through the service wing of the mansion, methodical in his tasks. A quiet, practiced efficiency born from years of knowing that no one notices the work unless it's done wrong. At 40, James carried himself with a certain unassuming strength. He wasn't tall enough to tower over anyone, but he had the solid build of a man who'd once been accustomed to long hours and physical discipline. His dark hair had just begun to show the faintest threads of gray at the temples, and his eyes, a deep, steady brown, seemed older than the rest of him. There was a calmness there, but also a weight, like the surface of a lake that hides the currents beneath. The staff knew little about him. He didn't volunteer stories, didn't linger in conversation during breaks, and kept his tone polite but reserved. Most assumed he'd been in the service industry for years. The truth was far different. 2 years earlier, his life had been unrecognizable from what it was now. He had lived in a modest but warm apartment in the city with his wife Claire and their daughter Lily. Music had been his life, not just a hobby, but his profession. James had played piano on stages, lit by chandeliers, and in concert halls where every note seemed to hang in the air like spun glass. Reviewers called him precise, lyrical, a musician who could make silence sing. But that world had collapsed the day Claire was diagnosed. The treatments were relentless, expensive, and exhausting. He sold his piano, the same one he'd practiced on since he was 12, to pay the first round of hospital bills. He stopped touring to be home with her, then stopped teaching lessons when her health began to fail faster than they'd expected. By the time she passed, the savings were gone, the apartment was half packed in boxes, and the only thing left untouched was the little upright piano in Lily's room, a battered secondhand thing she had loved to bang on as a toddler. After the funeral, James closed it. He hadn't lifted the lid since. Now the Morris estate was his livelihood. The pay was good, the hours regular, and the position came with quiet. Something he craved more than anything. He could work without the pressure of an audience, without the constant reminder of the life he'd lost. Lily was the reason for everything. At 8 years old, she had her mother's light brown hair and an infectious laugh that had somehow survived the last 2 years intact. James shielded her from as much of the struggle as he could, telling her the moves and job changes were adventures, and that someday things would be easier. She didn't need to know how many nights he stayed up worrying about the bills, or how hard it was to find a job that paid enough while still giving him time to be there when she came home from school. Working for Sophia Morris seemed at first like nothing more than a steady job. He took it without much thought, the way one accepts a post in a place they don't intend to leave or love. It was just work. The mansion was quiet during the day, the tasks predictable, and Sophia herself was mostly absent except for brief passes through the rooms. He hadn't expected her to notice him at all, let alone to single him out with a strange little joke about Mozart. It was harmless enough, but something about the way she'd said it, the spark in her eyes, the slight curve of her smile, lingered in his mind long after she'd walked away. And though he wouldn't have admitted it to anyone, that offhand remark had stirred something in him. Not irritation, not even amusement, but the faintest echo of a part of himself he'd locked away the day he closed Lily's piano. The house was unusually still that night. Outside, a fine mist had settled over the lawn, muting the world in shades of silver and shadow. The tall windows of the Morris mansion glowed softly against the darkness. But inside, most of the rooms were quiet, their lights dimmed. Sophia had stayed later than usual in her upstairs study, working through the last of a proposal that had kept her glued to her laptop for hours. Her head ached faintly, her eyes dry from staring at the screen. She decided to step away for a moment. A glass of water, maybe a walk through the silent halls to clear her mind. Padding down the curved staircase in her bare feet, she passed the long gallery that led toward the living room. It was then that she heard it. At first, she thought it was a recording, the soft, unmistakable swell of piano music drifting into the hall. The notes were clear, crystalline, each one placed with care, as though the player wasn't just performing, but conversing with the keys. She stopped mid-step, her head tilting toward the sound. The melody was Mozart, Piano Sonata number 11 in A major, she realized with a start, though she hadn't heard it live in years. Quietly, almost unconsciously, Sophia followed the sound. The open archway to the living room framed the scene like a painting. There, seated at the grand piano she had bought purely for its aesthetic appeal, was James Carter. His posture was perfect but unforced, his back straight, his hands moving fluidly across the keys. He wasn't glancing at sheet music. The song lived somewhere deeper, in his memory and muscle. She leaned against the doorway, careful not to disturb him. The lamplight from the corner caught the planes of his face, highlighting the concentration etched there. His brow was slightly furrowed, but his expression was far from tense. It was lost, in the way of someone stepping back into a world they thought they'd left behind forever. For Sophia, the room seemed to change as the music filled it. The air felt different, charged with something she couldn't quite name. She had seen James countless times over the past weeks, usually with a cloth in his hand, bent over some household task. But here, he was someone else entirely. A man who belonged in concert halls, whose hands carried both precision and emotion in equal measure. She noticed the way his eyes softened when the melody shifted, how his breathing matched the rhythm without him seeming to realize it. He wasn't just playing, he was remembering. Sophia realized her pulse had quickened. There was something intimate about watching him like this, as though she were witnessing a secret he hadn't meant to share. The final notes faded into the silence like a sigh. James let his hands rest lightly on the keys for a moment before lowering them into his lap. He didn't turn around. She wondered if he had known she was there the whole time. "Beautiful," she said softly, breaking the quiet. He turned slightly, his expression calm but unreadable. "I didn't mean to disturb you, Miss Morris." "You didn't," she replied, stepping into the room. Her gaze lingered on the piano. "I didn't know you could play like that." James's eyes flicked toward the keys, then back to her. "It's been a long time." There was a weight in his voice, something unspoken but palpable. She felt a strange urge to press, to know more, but the moment was fragile, and she didn't want to shatter it. Instead, she offered the faintest smile. "Well, I suppose if I'd known, I might have been serious about my little Mozart comment." This time there was the ghost of a smile at the corner of his mouth, fleeting, almost reluctant. "Good thing you weren't." She didn't answer right away. Part of her wanted to stay, to hear him play again, but the other part understood that whatever had brought him to this piano tonight wasn't meant for an audience. So she nodded once and left the room, the echo of his music following her down the hall. Upstairs, as she returned to her desk, Sophia realized she was no longer thinking about her proposal or her deadlines. She was thinking about James, about the man behind the uniform, and the question that had begun to take root in her mind. What else didn't she know about him? The morning after she heard him play, Sophia found herself lingering in the kitchen longer than usual. She wasn't a woman given to idle curiosity. In her world, questions were asked with purpose. Answers weighed for their utility. But the image of James at the piano had stayed with her all night. She had replayed it in her mind. The way his hands moved without hesitation, the concentration in his face, and the unmistakable emotional current beneath every note. When she finally saw him that day, he was in the library, dusting the shelves that reached nearly to the ceiling. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, dust motes drifting lazily in the golden beams. He glanced over when she entered, offering the polite nod he always did, then returned to his work. "James," she began, her voice measured but softer than usual. "About last night." He paused mid-motion, the cloth still in his hand. "Yes, Ms. Morris?" "You play beautifully," she said, stepping further into the room. "Not like someone who took lessons as a child and then forgot most of it. You play like a professional." James hesitated before answering, as though deciding whether to deflect or tell the truth. "I was," he said finally. Sophia stopped beside one of the leather chairs, resting her hand on its back. "Was?" He replaced a book on the shelf, aligning it perfectly with the others. "A long time ago. Another life." Her curiosity sharpened. "What happened?" James lowered his gaze briefly, then looked back at her. There was no bitterness in his expression, only the calmness of someone who had told this story before, though perhaps not often. "I trained for years," he said, "went to conservatory, competed, toured. Music was everything. I thought it always would be." He set the cloth down on a nearby table, his hands folding loosely in front of him. "Then my wife, Claire, got sick. Cancer. It moved fast. Treatments were expensive, and even when I wasn't traveling, I couldn't be away from her for long. I sold my piano to pay for her care. Stopped performing, stopped teaching. Every bit of energy went to making sure she was as comfortable as possible." Sophia felt an unfamiliar tightness in her chest as she listened. She had seen illness dismantle lives before, employees who suddenly disappeared from the office, friends whose bright energy dimmed overnight, but hearing it from him, stripped of self-pity, hit differently. "She passed away 2 years ago," James continued. "Lily was 6. After that, I didn't touch a piano again. It wasn't just that I didn't have one. Playing hurt. It reminded me of everything I'd lost, and I couldn't carry that every time I sat down at the keys." The silence that followed was gentle, not awkward. Sophia studied him for a long moment. He wasn't fishing for sympathy, wasn't dramatizing his loss. He was simply stating the facts of how his life had been dismantled and rebuilt into something smaller, quieter, stripped of the music that had once defined him. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. He gave a small nod, as if accepting the sentiment but not dwelling on it. "I found other work. Something steady. Something that let me be home when Lily got out of school. That mattered more than anything else." Sophia's eyes drifted to the piano in the living room beyond the archway. "And last night? Why play then? James's gaze followed hers. For a moment, his features softened in a way she hadn't seen before. Sometimes the silence gets too loud, he said. I was just remembering what it felt like. That's all. Sophia didn't push further. She knew enough about walls to recognize when someone wasn't ready to lower them completely. But as she left the library, she felt a shift inside herself. A quiet awareness that her casual remark about Mozart had brushed against something real, something fragile. She had thought she was the one in control of their conversations, the one setting the tone. Now she wasn't so sure. The rain had been falling steadily all afternoon, turning the driveway of the Morris estate into a gleaming ribbon of wet black stone. Sophia sat in the small sitting room off the main hall, sipping tea and reviewing a thick packet of quarterly projections. The rhythmic patter against the tall windows was almost hypnotic, so much so that she didn't notice James pass by the doorway at first. When she did, she caught something unusual in his stride, a stiffness, as though he were carrying something heavier than the basket of freshly laundered linens in his hands. James, she called softly. He stopped, his back straightening before he turned to face her. Yes, Miss Morris? Put those down for a moment, she said, gesturing toward the empty chair across from her. You look like you've just been handed bad news. For a second, she thought he might deny it, but instead he stepped into the room, setting the linens carefully on a side table before taking the seat. His hands remained clasped in his lap, his gaze fixed on them. It's Lily, he said finally, his voice quiet. Her pediatrician called this morning. The tests from last week. They found something. She has a heart defect they hadn't caught before. It's serious. They say she'll need surgery within the next 2 months. Sophia felt her breath still. She had no children, but she knew enough to hear the weight behind those words. How serious? James exhaled slowly, the sound almost a sigh. Without the surgery, her heart will weaken over time. Too much strain, and... He didn't finish the sentence. The good news is the surgery has a high success rate. The bad news is the cost. Even with insurance, it's more than I can cover. There was no drama in his tone, no plea for help. It was simply the truth, delivered as plainly as if he were reporting the weather. But Sophia could see the strain in the lines around his eyes, then the faint tremor in his right hand. What will you do? She asked. I'll find the money, he said without hesitation. I can take extra work. Nights, weekends. I'll call some people I know in the city. See if there's short-term contract labor I can do. I've done it before. And how long will that take you? She pressed. He hesitated. Too long, he admitted. But I can't just stand still. Every dollar I earn brings me closer. Lily. She doesn't deserve to wait. Sophia leaned back in her chair, watching him carefully. This was the same man she'd seen polish the piano keys with the precision of a jeweler. The same man who had played Mozart with a depth that had startled her. And here he was, speaking with the steady determination of someone who had already decided that his own comfort, his own limits, were irrelevant in the face of what needed to be done. A flash of memory crossed her mind. Her own father years ago, working double shifts to keep her in school after her mother left. She remembered the way he had carried his exhaustion like armor, refusing to let her see how heavy it was. James rose to his feet after a moment. I'm sorry to bring this into your home. It's not your problem. Sophia's eyes narrowed slightly. When someone in my house is carrying something like this, it becomes my problem. Her tone was sharper than she intended, and his gaze flickered to hers in surprise. She softened her voice. James, you can't do this alone. I've been doing it alone for a long time, he said. She didn't argue, but as he picked up the basket and left the room, Sophia knew she wouldn't be able to simply watch him try to climb this mountain on his own. There was a part of her, the part that had been stirred the night she heard him play, that refused to let him drown in this quietly. By the time she returned to her projections, she was no longer thinking about quarterly growth or investor calls. She was thinking about Lily, about the surgery, and about how to turn the kind of offhand joke she had once made about Mozart into something that could actually change a life. The following evening, the mansion seemed unusually quiet. The staff had finished their work for the day, and the echo of their footsteps had faded down the service hallways. Sophia sat alone in the living room, the only light coming from the tall lamp near the piano. The black surface of the instrument gleamed under the warm glow, every curve polished to perfection. She'd been waiting for this moment all day, rehearsing the words in her head, but now that it was here, she felt a strange flutter of uncertainty. When James finally appeared, it was with his usual steady stride, carrying a folded stack of towels under one arm. He stopped when he saw her seated there, one leg crossed over the other, her gaze fixed on the piano. "Ms. Morris," he said with a polite nod, "I didn't realize you were still up." "I was waiting for you," she replied. His brow furrowed slightly, but he didn't move from where he stood. "Is something wrong?" "That depends on your definition of wrong." She gestured toward the piano bench. "Sit for a minute. I want to talk to you." He hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the directness of the request, but after a moment, he crossed the room and set the towels down on a nearby chair. He remained standing, hands loosely at his sides. "It's about Lily," Sophia said, her voice measured but firm. "I know you're trying to find the money for her surgery, and I know you're willing to work yourself into the ground to get it." James's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "It's my responsibility. I'll handle it." "That's not the point," she said, leaning forward slightly. "The point is, there's a faster way, one that doesn't involve you breaking yourself in the process." He gave her a wary look. "And what would that be?" She let the silence stretch for a moment before answering. "Next month, I'm hosting a charity evening here. High-profile guests, people who write 5- and 6-figure checks without blinking. I want you to play for them." His reaction was immediate, a flicker of something in his eyes quickly buried under a mask of composure. "No," he said quietly. Sophia tilted her head. "No, I haven't performed in years," he replied. "Not for an audience, and certainly not in a room full of strangers in tuxedos sipping champagne. That part of my life is over." She stood then, taking a step closer to him. "James, I'm not asking because I think it would be entertaining for my guests. I'm asking because I know what will happen when they hear you play. They'll see what I saw. They'll feel what I felt. And when they feel it, they'll give more than enough to cover Lily's surgery." He looked away, his gaze fixed on some point in the shadowed corner of the room. "It's not that simple." "It is," she countered, her voice softening. "I'll cover the entire cost of the surgery myself if you agree to play that night. I'll make sure the hospital has the payment before Lily even sets foot inside. No fundraising, no waiting, just music." For one evening, the silence between them deepened. James's hands curled slightly at his sides, his breathing even but heavier than before. She could almost see the conflict working through him. The instinct to protect himself from the pain of returning to the piano, weighed against the reality of what it could mean for his daughter. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter. "You don't understand. Playing again, it's not just about sitting down and hitting the keys. It's opening a door I've kept shut for a reason. Everything I lost is on the other side of it." Sophia's expression softened, but her tone remained steady. "And maybe, so is everything you still have. You'd be doing it for her, James. Not for me, not for them. For Lily." He met her eyes then, and for the first time she saw the unguarded depth of his hesitation. But beneath it was something else. The same unwavering devotion that had driven him to plan for sleepless weeks of extra labor, to bear the burden alone without complaint. Finally he exhaled slowly, the decision settling over him like a weight. "One night," he said. "That's all I can promise." "That's all I'm asking," Sophia replied. For a moment neither moved. Then James nodded once, almost to himself, and left the room without another word. The sound of his footsteps faded down the hall, leaving Sophia alone with the piano. She stayed there for a while longer, her gaze lingering on its glossy surface. She knew what she had just asked of him was more than a favor. It was an unearthing. But she also knew that when the night came, and his hands touched the keys again, the room would change, and so would everything else. The night of the charity event arrived with the kind of opulence only Sophia Morris could orchestrate. By early evening, the long drive leading up to the mansion was lined with sleek black cars, each delivering guests in evening gowns and tailored suits. The front entrance was alive with warm golden light spilling from the chandeliers inside, the sound of polite laughter and the faint clink of champagne glasses drifting out into the cool night air. Inside, the living room had been transformed into an intimate performance space. The grand piano sat at the center like a jewel, its polished black surface gleaming under a halo of soft spotlights. Around it, clusters of chairs were arranged in gentle arcs, ensuring every guest would have a clear view. Crystal flutes of champagne sparkled in the guests' hands as they mingled, unaware of the storm of emotions brewing just beyond their sight. James had arrived early, at Sophia's request, dressed in a simple but perfectly cut black suit she had insisted on providing for him. It felt strange against his skin. Not uncomfortable exactly, but unfamiliar, like a remnant from a part of his life he had locked away. He stood in a small side room, the murmur of voices from the main hall filtering through the door. On a table nearby sat a photograph of Lily he had tucked into his pocket earlier. He looked at it now, drawing a slow, steadying breath. Sophia appeared in the doorway, her dark hair swept into a graceful chignon, the deep blue of her gown catching the light like midnight silk. "They're ready," she said softly. He glanced at her, searching her expression for some signal that he could still back out. But she only gave him a small, steady nod. Not urging, not pushing, just holding him to the promise he'd made. When James stepped into the living room, a ripple passed through the crowd. Some looked at him with polite curiosity, assuming he was a hired musician. Others recognized him as the man they'd seen quietly moving through the mansion during past visits. He didn't meet their eyes. His focus was on the piano. He sat down on the bench, the leather smooth and cool beneath him, and rested his hands lightly on his knees for a moment. The noise of the room dimmed, fading into an expectant hush. Then, without glancing at any sheet music, he placed his fingers on the keys. The first notes of Mozart's Piano Sonata No. 11 rang out, clear and bright, filling the space with a warmth that seemed to gather everyone closer. His touch was sure but unhurried, each phrase flowing into the next like a thought unfolding. For James, the room began to dissolve. The silk gowns, the champagne, the wealth, they all fell away. It was just him, the piano, and the memory of every night he had once played with his heart wide open. He felt the old ache rise, the one that carried the grief of Claire's absence. But this time, it didn't stop him. This time it wove itself into the music, deepening the sound until it was something more than a performance. Sophia, standing near the edge of the room, found herself unable to move. She had expected skill, even beauty. But this was something different. She could see it in the guests too, the way their faces softened, their shoulders loosened, as if they were being quietly disarmed. As he played, James thought of Lily, of her small hand gripping his when she was frightened, of the way her laughter could break through even his darkest days. Every crescendo was for her, every lingering note a promise. By the time he reached the final measures, the air in the room felt charged, like the stillness after a summer storm. The last chord faded into silence, and for a heartbeat no one moved. Then the applause began. Not polite, not perfunctory, but thunderous, rising from every corner of the room. James stood slowly, giving a small nod of acknowledgement before stepping back from the piano. His hands were trembling, though whether from nerves or the sheer release of what he'd just done, he couldn't say. Sophia crossed to him through the crowd, her eyes bright. She leaned in just enough for him to hear her over the applause. "You didn't just play, James," she said quietly. "You reminded them, all of them, what it means to feel." Later that night, after the guests had departed and the mansion had grown quiet again, Sophia handed him a sealed envelope. Inside was the full payment for Lily's surgery, the check already made out to the hospital. "It's done," she said simply. James stared at it for a long moment, his throat tightening. He wanted to thank her, but the words seemed too small for what she had given him. Instead, he just nodded, the weight in his chest both heavy and unbearably light. And though he would never admit it aloud, he knew something else had shifted that night. Not just for Lily, not just for him, but for the part of himself he thought had been lost forever. The hospital room was quiet except for the soft beeping of the heart monitor and the faint hum of the ventilation system. Morning light filtered in through half-drawn blinds, painting pale stripes across the bed where Lily lay sleeping, her small chest rising and falling in an even rhythm. The surgery had been 2 days ago, and every hour since had felt like a lifetime to James. Now, for the first time in months, the tight coil of fear in his chest had begun to loosen. He sat in the chair beside her bed, elbows resting on his knees, his hand loosely holding hers. The fourth line taped to her arm seemed impossibly fragile, but the color had returned to her cheeks, and the faintest smile played at her lips even in sleep. She'd be going home soon. Sophia stood quietly in the doorway, watching for a moment before stepping inside. She wasn't in her usual immaculate dress or heels. Instead, she wore a simple cream sweater and dark trousers, her hair loosely pulled back. She moved with the careful quiet of someone who understood she was entering a sacred space. "How is she?" Sophia's voice was low, almost reverent. James glanced up, and the tiredness in his face was softened by relief. "Better. Stronger. The doctors say everything went exactly as it should." Sophia came closer, standing on the other side of the bed. For a moment, she simply looked at Lily, then at James. "You should be proud of her," she said. "I'm proud of both of us," he admitted, his voice thick. "I didn't think I'd make it through the last few weeks without falling apart." "You didn't just make it through," she replied. "You fought for her every second." They stayed like that for a while, the silence not awkward, but full of unspoken understanding. Eventually, Sophia reached into her bag and pulled out a small wrapped package. She placed it on the table beside Lily's bed. "What's that?" James asked. "A gift," she said, "for when she's well enough to open it." He didn't press her for details. Instead, he nodded his thanks, feeling the familiar difficulty of accepting kindness without repayment. A week later, Lily walked out of the hospital, her hand in her father's, her steps still a little cautious, but steadier with each one. Waiting at the curb was one of Sophia's cars, a quiet gesture to ensure their trip home was as easy as possible. Life didn't transform overnight, but it changed in ways that mattered. James resumed his work at the mansion, but his duties shifted. Sophia had offered him the position of estate manager, with living quarters on the property for him and Lily. It meant stability, safety, and the kind of time together that money alone could never buy. One afternoon, a month after the surgery, James returned from inspecting the grounds to hear music drifting from the living room. He stepped inside to find Lily sitting at the grand piano, her legs too short to reach the pedals, her fingers tapping at the keys in an unsteady but determined attempt at melody. Sophia sat beside her, showing her where to place her hands, smiling with each small success. James leaned against the doorway, watching them. The scene was so different from the first time he'd stood in that spot. No longer a man closed off from his past, but someone whose world had widened again, letting the music back in. That evening, after Lily had gone to bed, James found himself alone in the living room. The house was quiet, the soft lamplight reflecting off the piano surface. He sat down and began to play. Not for an audience, not for a cause, but simply because he wanted to. The notes filled the air, warm and unhurried, and for the first time in years, the act brought him peace instead of pain. Sophia passed by the doorway, drawn by the sound. She didn't interrupt, just stood in the shadows and listened until the last chord faded. When he finally looked up, their eyes met, and she gave him a small, knowing smile before disappearing down the hall. James turned back to the keys, his fingers resting on them for a long moment before he closed the lid. Outside, the night was deep and still, but inside there was a sense of something beginning, a quiet promise of better days, made not in words but in music and the simple act of staying. Some stories close quietly, with nothing more than the satisfaction of a goal reached. But this one leaves behind something deeper, a reminder that what we think we've lost forever can return when we least expect it, and often through the most unlikely people. James didn't just save his daughter's life. He reclaimed a part of himself he had buried under years of grief and responsibility. Sophia didn't simply write a check. She learned that leadership, at its best, is personal. It's seeing the person behind the role, the story behind the job title. The surgery was a victory, yes, but the real triumph was the music returning to the house, to James's hands, and to the life of a little girl who would grow up knowing her father's courage was matched only by his love. It's proof that sometimes a passing remark, even one meant as a joke, can open the door to something extraordinary.